Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tracy Noah from the Marion Library Service, and welcome to our Library Through the Lens live webinar, which is part of our series of adult programs delivered differently. Today, thanks to Affirm Press, we welcome Melbourne-based author, bookseller, and freelance book editor, Jaclyn Crupi, as she talks about her book, Garden Like a Nonno, in which she shares everything she learned about productive gardening from her nonnos Michele and Vincenzo. Jaclyn has written several children's books and has worked in publishing and book selling since 2002. She has a Bachelor of Arts, English and Cinema Studies from Melbourne University and a graduate diploma in editing and publishing from RMIT. She has contributed book reviews to Slow magazine and is a regular Bookstagrammer. Please feel free at any time during the presentation to type questions you have into the Q&A or chat feed on your screens, and Jaclyn will answer these at the end of her talk. Now, please sit back, grab a cuppa or some lunch, and please welcome special guest Jaclyn Crupi.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining on this Friday afternoon to talk about gardening. Just bear with me one moment while I share my presentation and so we can get started. Okay. So my name is Jaclyn Crupi and I'll be talking about my book, Garden Like a Nonno, and about how to have a thriving, productive garden. There will be time for questions at the end, and I do look forward to answering any you might have. I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land where I live, write, garden, and tell stories. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water, storytelling, and culture, and pay respects to elders past and present. Whenever I talk about my nonnos, I talk about the huge influence they've had on my life, and that I say that I wouldn't be who I am without them. They taught me how to care for and constantly improve my soil, how to save and plant seeds, how to raise chickens, how to maintain and repair garden tools. The book is dedicated to my nonnos, so I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about each of them. This is my paternal grandfather, Michele, on his wedding day there, looking very spiffy. He lived next door to us growing up, and there was no fence separating the two properties. So our backyard was really his backyard. The thing I remember most about that garden is the peas that he grew. He grew the most delicious and prolific peas, of which I ate a lot, and I never got into trouble for doing that, which I feel very lucky about, now knowing that peas aren't the easiest things to grow. So when I was young, Nonno Michele built me a rabbit hutch, and he gave me my very own rabbit. I loved that rabbit. I took that rabbit for walks in my little doll pram. I snuck it into my bedroom, which I was not allowed to do. I fed it far too much lettuce from the garden, which I also was not meant to be doing. But what I didn't know was that my nonno was also feeding my rabbit. And at one point, it actually got too big for the hutch that he had made it. And the next day when I got home from kinder, I was told the rabbit was gone. And Nonno said that it had run away. It didn't occur to me to question the meal that was on our dinner table that night, which I'm sure you've all seen it coming, but it was rabbit. Nonno Michele was very good at woodwork, and he was a true jack of all trades. He could fix or make anything. During daylight hours, he was almost never seen indoors. And then this is my maternal nonno Vincenzo, and that's my mum there. My sister and I used to spend school holidays at their place. Nonno never wore a watch while he gardened, yet he came in consistently every day at 10 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. for a coffee. And he claimed that he could tell the time using the sun. I still don't know how he did that, how he managed to be so precise without any sort of clock or watch, and I'll never know now. He certainly had a soft spot for his grandchildren, and he would often sneak us pieces of chocolate. Nonno Vincenzo came to my garden here in the house that I live now, and he taught me how to prune every single fruit tree in the garden. At that time, there were 11, and thanks to everything he's taught me, there's a lot more than that now. He used to grow tomato seedlings for me to plant in my garden for many years, and it was a real honour to take over doing that and planting them in his garden for him in his later years when he wasn't able to do that anymore. I've been lucky enough to inherit a lot of his gardening tools, and every time I use them, I think of him. And every time I save the seeds of broad beans or various lettuce varieties that he gave me, I'm really, really grateful. But we need to go back to basics and talk about what a nonno is. So of course, a nonno is the Italian word for grandfather, but I see it as more a state of mind. I think we all have nonnos in us. There's actually a quiz at the start of the book that you can use to assess your nonno potential and see if there's any areas you might need to work on. So nonnos are certainly known for their gardening skills, but they're also known for their unwillingness to throw anything away, their ability to build and repair anything as well. They're really practical and resilient people. And my nonnos really taught me that even when I think I have nothing, I actually have everything if I just shift how I look at things. So nonnos certainly aren't afraid of a little bit of hard work. And it is worth noting that a nonno found outside Italy left their home country and moved somewhere else. Chances are with his favourite veggie seeds buried deep in his case, as was the case with both my nonnos. He might have been quite young when he did that. He might not have spoken the language of the country that he moved to. He might have had small children. He may very well have gone looking for work the very day he arrived in that new country. And he did all of that for his family, for them to have more than he had, for them to thrive and succeed in a new place with better opportunities. So speaking as the beneficiary of those opportunities, this is me. I was born in Australia and raised in the Italian culture. My grandparents played huge roles in my upbringing. I now write and edit books and work at a bookshop. And my passions are very much reading, cooking and gardening. And I really make sure to uphold certain family traditions that I've done since childhood, like Tomato Day, which is that picture there. And I make pasta weekly, and I'm very proud of my Italian heritage. Before I launch fully into nonno, I should just say that this is actually the second book that I've written about what I've learned from my grandparents. The first was published in April last year, and that's Nonno Knows Best. And it's a particular joy to see these two books together. So here we go. Let's talk about Nonno's gardening style. So I personally think the ability to grow your own food should never be taken for granted. It's an incredibly useful life skill. It's also great to have a hobby that gets you outside and is good for your physical and mental well-being. And you're doing something that's fruitful and productive, quite literally. I can't think of better gardening teachers than my nonnos. They taught me how to grow my own produce and take care of the soil, and now maybe they're going to teach you too. I should say that I'm not a horticulturalist, and neither were my nonnos. They just knew what worked and what didn't, and that's what they taught me, and that's what I now do, and that's what this book is about. So Nonno's gardening style is incredibly frugal. If he can make something himself rather than buy it, he absolutely would do that. In the book, I include my nonno's recipes for things like seed raising mix, seaweed fertilizer, and white oil. They're all things you can buy, of course, but nonno always made his own. Cheaper, easier, why not? Nonnos do tend to garden fence to fence, with produce sort of pumping out every available space. And they waste nothing and find a use for everything. I still use beer bottles for my passata that my nonno used in the 70s. Nonnos aren't blitz gardeners. They don't just go out there for one day, one day of the weekend, once a month, and do a big blitz. They're out there every day doing a little bit and keeping their eye on things. Nonnos absolutely take care of the things that they have, whether that's their gardening tools or their chickens, or if you're lucky like me, their grandchildren. Now, I thought I'd just quickly show you the contents of the book. So I'm having some problems with my slides. There we go. Just to show what part of the book I'll be talking about today. Today will really be about chapters 1 and 2, soil and seeds. I will very briefly, depending on time, touch on the other chapters. And I hope I don't overwhelm any new gardeners, and then for experienced gardeners, I hope there's something in here for you as well. Okay, so starting with soil. The basis of productive gardening is the soil, and improving your soil is a lifelong project. It doesn't matter if you're starting with an old garden bed, a new raised wicking bed, pots on a balcony, if you're ripping up a grassed area or converting your verge, whatever you might be doing, regardless of the state of that soil, you will be able to use it to grow food eventually. Soil can just always be improved, and as your soil gets healthier, so too will the plants that you grow, and the food that you grow. And healthy soil grows strong plants, it retains moisture, it provides a home for many beneficial insects and worms, and it really feels and smells wonderful. So the key thing to establish at the start is whether you have sandy or heavy clay soil. Where I am here in inner Melbourne, it's heavy clay. And so I had to do a few things at the start to break that up, and that was digging in a lot of gypsum. If you've got sandier soil, there's different things you need to add. There's a list there. But once you establish that, then it's just you go to general soil upkeep. I did try to find out the soil type in Marion in your region, and I found it's very fertile, I hear, which is great. Lucky you guys. But yeah, I couldn't find out if it was sandy or clay. Gosh. Sorry about that. So I'm going to talk about manure, which is one of my favorite things, whether it's from sheep, chickens, cows, horses, even llamas. It's all great stuff. The key thing that you need to know about manure is that it needs to be aged before you use it in your veggie patch, because it can, if it's really fresh manure, can burn plants and spread weed seeds. So any manure that you buy from a nursery will already be aged, so you can use it immediately. But if you're like my nonnos and myself, and you prefer to go to a friend's farm and shovel a trailer full of free manure for the garden, then just be sure to leave it in a pile for a few months before you start adding it to the garden. I use an old compost bin to do this that I got in Hard Rubbish. So when you are using aged manure, you do need to dig it into the garden a little. Nonnos taught me it's not a no-dig gardening, I'm afraid. So you don't want to leave manure sitting on the soil surface, because you can lose a lot of nitrogen, especially if it's chicken manure. So just gently forking it into the topsoil. I also like to make a manure tea out of some of the manure I collect. And that's part of that nonno thinking about getting bang for your buck. All I do is I put some manure, any kind that I have, in a hessian bag, and then I put that hessian bag in a bucket of water. Depending how heavy it is, I might need to weigh it down with a brick. You need to make sure the manure is sort of submerged in the water. And then after a couple of hours, you can pull out that hessian sack. That manure inside the hessian sack, you can put in your compost, you can put it straight into your garden, it's ready to be used. And the water that's in the bucket is a beautiful liquid manure that can go straight onto the garden. You can almost watch them grow as you water them. So the other thing about manures is that different manures contain different nutrient levels. They're not all equal. For veggies, personally, I like chicken manure best. It's packed with nitrogen and phosphorus, which most of the productive plants that I like to grow really love. I also have 4 chickens in my backyard, so I have a free supply of the stuff. So of course I'm going to put it to good use. For my fruit trees, I prefer cow manure. It's really great for improving soil structure, and it tends to release its nutrients much more slowly than chicken manure, so the trees have access to it for a longer period of time. Horse manure is also really good for a productive garden, but it does have a lot of weed seeds, so I just make sure I age it really well, or I bury it quite deeply and let the worms do the work for me. The other great kind of manure I love is green manure. So you can buy seed mixes, or you can use any leftover seeds that you might have in your seed bank, and we'll be talking a lot about seed banks later. I find it's best to never leave a veggie bed completely bare, because if you do, nutrients can leave the soil and weeds can take over. So if you ever have a gap in your planting, or you're going to be away for some reason, I just throw down some green manure seeds. They add so many nutrients, mainly nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, all good things to have in your soil. So the way I do it, I put the seed down, and then I cover it with netting, because if I don't do that, I find the local birds think that I've put down some bird seed for them, and they eat it all up. So I do have to cover it with some netting, and then sort of within 1 to 2 weeks, the seeds have germinated and I can remove that. And then after about 6 weeks, the green manure can be dug into the soil, or if you have chickens, just set them up and let them do that for you, because it does continue to add nutrients as it breaks down. The key thing about it is to make sure that you have it dug in before it's gone to seed, because otherwise you're going to be digging those seeds into your soil that you potentially don't want. So my other favorite thing is compost. I always say it's the answer to almost every productive gardening question. When making compost, it needs to have the right balance of green material and brown material. You hear that all the time. And so brown material is things like cardboard, egg cartons, shredded paper, straw, hay, dry leaves. And then green material is garden clippings, grass clippings, veggie scraps, and green leaves. So it's 2 parts brown material to 1 part green. And I actually find that balance quite tricky to keep. I have far more green materials than I do brown. So what I do is in autumn, I go around the streets of my neighbourhood and I collect dry leaves, and I keep them in large plastic tubs and right next to my compost bin. So if I ever feel I'm adding a lot of green and I immediately have a handful of brown, I can just add to it, and that keeps it really happy. I think of manure and compost as best friends, and I always add them together at the same time. It's just a really nutrient-packed combo that's going to improve your soil and just make sure that your productive plants have pretty much everything that they're going to need to flower and develop fruit. So before I plant anything, at an absolute minimum, I add some compost and I add some manure. I do it every growing season, hopefully for forever. And that's certainly what my nonnos did. In the book, I talk about some simple steps to starting a compost bin. I imagine if you're here on a Friday lunchtime hearing about gardening, you may well already have a compost bin, so I won't go through that. Something I will quickly go through is how to speed up compost, because the best compost is fast compost. So aeration is really important. You can buy one of those cool twisty things to do that, or just be old school like Nonno and use a shovel. Adding some blood and bone or some rock dust is great. Same with comfrey. I grow comfrey for a few reasons in my garden. It's in the seaweed fertilizer recipe that we'll get to soon, but it's great. It immediately picks up the pace in the compost and makes it break down really well. Adding some lime less regularly, just about once a month. It's a lovely sweetener. And then this is the controversial one, and I will talk about peeing in and on things a few times because my nonnos did it, and it's something that we all just have all the time, readily available and free to use. So I recommend you pee in your compost. That uric acid really does accelerate compost decomposition. It's also full of nitrogen. It's great stuff. Nonno recommends it. And like I said, it's going to come up a few times. I hope I don't lose anybody because of it, but it's a, you know, here in Melbourne lockdown, there was a point where I thought I don't have any liquid fertilizer. And then I realized, actually, yes, I do. We will get to that. So worms, I won't lie to you, neither of my nonnos actually did have worm farms, but I do, and I think they're great. And I think if my nonnos knew about them, they would be into them too. You can use an old bathtub, you can use a polystyrene tub, you can buy one. There's so many ways to make a quick, you can use an old esky, great ways to make a quick worm farm. And if you have a lot of kitchen scraps, I think having a worm farm is fantastic. Worms don't actually produce any nutrients themselves, but they consume those kitchen scraps and then they convert them into castings, which is a really wonderful soil conditioner. So any nutrients and minerals that go into your worm farm in the form of kitchen scraps come out in a form that can actually be absorbed by plants. They contain millions of beneficial bacteria and other organisms that are really essential to soil and plant health. You can also use the castings to make a quick fertilizer in the same way as I said with the manure with the Hessian bag. And you can always add some castings to the soil when you're adding compost and manure if you have it. It's great stuff. It's good to put it to good use. If you ever have a bag of old sad potting mix, you can also use some worm castings to freshen it up. So old potting mix can always be brought back to life. And then, of course, there's the liquid that drains out of the worm farm. It's not as nutrient rich as the castings, but I still think it's absolute gold for the garden. So you do need to dilute it though, sort of 1 part worm juice to 10 parts water. And that ratio will come up a lot with a lot of liquid fertilizer. So I found that worms are happy to process most foods, but it's best not to feed them too much onion, garlic, or citrus. And if you are feeding them citrus skins, cut them up quite small. And then I don't give my worms any dairy, meat, bones, fish, or grease. I just think they can't process that. And the key thing I think a lot of people get wrong with worm farms is they overfeed them. Worm farms don't work anywhere near as quickly as composting does. And worms can actually only eat their body weight. So 1 kilogram of worms, which is about 4,000 worms, can eat 1 kilogram of food per week. So of course, if you have a huge worm population, you can feed it more than that, but you do need to sort of go a bit easy. And if your worm farm does start to smell, it probably means you've overfed it. And I find just adding some lime and leaving it alone for a while is the thing to do. So there are other favourite nonno fertilisers. Blood and bone's a big one, and the smell of blood and bone takes me immediately back to my childhood. I also add a handful of it each time I plant a tomato seedling. I planted my tomato seedlings last weekend and they all got a handful. It's so full of nitrogen and phosphorus, it's great stuff. Here we go with urine again. Nonno's not afraid to use urine on his garden. The classic place, of course, is a lemon tree, but you can also, and I recommend that you do, pee on empty garden beds. It's rich in nitrogen, but it is high in salt, so you don't want to overdo it. And of course, never pee directly onto plants. Though you can use urine as a liquid fertilizer if you dilute it with 1 part urine to 10 parts water. It's free, you always have it. It's worth putting it to use. Another thing it's worth putting to use is ash and charcoal. So Nonno doesn't waste anything. He wouldn't throw these things away. He finds a use for everything. So any ash and charcoal that are left in the fireplace or the fire pit, or more likely the pizza oven, he will sieve them and separate the charcoal from the wood ash. Wood ash is a really great source of potassium and lime, which means it's very alkaline. So you don't want to put it on acid-loving plants. So not on potatoes and blueberries, those sorts of plants. But it's great for things like broad beans and tomatoes that use potash to set fruit. You can also put some in your compost, not huge quantities, but you can definitely put it in your compost. I also find it great to combat cherry slug. I'm not sure if you guys have a problem with cherry slug, but we certainly do here. It's a little black slug that attacks the leaves of pear, cherry, plum, and quince trees. And so it's messy, but I get handfuls of wood ash and I throw them onto the tree, and sort of that sort of motion. It's quite dramatic. And it suffocates the slug and prevents it doing any more damage to the tree. With those larger pieces of charcoal, both of my nonnos had a lidded bucket that they would add them to, and then they would pee into it. Because I think this is the last mention, I promise. So until that bucket is full, and then it can go into the compost. And my nonnos didn't know words like activated charcoal or biochar. They didn't know that they were charging the charcoal with nutrients, but that's exactly what they were doing. And giving the charcoal, allowing the charcoal to feed the plants. If you just put a lot of charcoal in your garden, it's not great. But if it has been activated in this way, it can really be beneficial to your garden. I make a liquid fertilizer out of weeds, and that's all part of that. Even when you think you have nothing, you have everything. So there's always something on hand is definitely what my nonnos taught me. So to make weed tea, you simply put weeds into a large plastic garden pot, you know, the kinds with holes at the bottom. And then you want to place that pot into a bucket of water, ideally a lidded bucket if you have one. And the weeds, it's really important that the weeds are submerged again. So you might put a brick on top if you need to. After about 6 weeks, and you can actually add some kitchen scraps to that too. I often add carrot peelings and that sort of thing, because all the nutrients from the weeds will leach out into the water. It takes about 6 weeks. You drain out the inner bucket and it will be a brown sludge. It won't be beautiful, but it will be completely dead. And so it can go into the compost. You won't be spreading weeds this way. But then what you're left with in the bucket is a really beneficial liquid fertilizer that you can use watered down 10:1 on any leafy greens. Love it. I find I use it on every vegetable I grow. And I primarily grow Mediterranean vegetables, but they all love it. And it really keeps my garden going. The other liquid fertilizer is seaweed. I'll go to the recipe. As a child, whenever I used to go to the beach with my nonnos, they used to wander off and they would do two things. They would go and get some abalone, which they probably couldn't do anymore, but they would also get a little bag or bucket of seaweed together, quite fresh seaweed. They never took very much and they never took it from the same place. They sort of walked a bit. So they were very careful and responsible about how they did it. But then take it home and make it into a seaweed fertilizer, which I still make 1 20-litre bucket of per year, which is enough for my garden. I add some comfrey and borage to it. You don't have to. My nonnos didn't, but I just find that gives an extra little boost to it all. This one does take 3 months though, so you do have to play the long game and I get it happening at the start of winter so that it's ready for my spring garden. So I know I'm talking about soil, but even the healthiest soil can't support food plants without water. Both of my nonnos had very elaborate and weird DIY plumbing systems set up where they collected from the stormwater pipe, and they had big plastic barrels everywhere that they would go out in the rain and move things around. I must admit, I have a rainwater tank, which I find really useful. Harvesting the water that falls on your property is really important. But if I was starting from scratch now and I wanted raised beds, I really would consider wicking beds. I think they're wonderful with the reservoir of water on the bottom. You lose a lot less to evaporation. I think they're wonderful things. And then for balconies, I think self-watering pots are really great. But the big questions I'm most often asked about water is how much to water. And unfortunately, I can't answer that question for you because it depends on so many things. But my message would be to water consistently and deeply. So shallow watering really does encourage quite shallow roots, and that makes your plants quite vulnerable to all sorts of things, hot spells, winds, whereas deep watering encourages deep roots so that they're able to go and search for water if they need to, and it anchors them better against wind. In terms of when to water, my nonnos used to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to water their gardens. I don't do that, but I certainly do water in the morning. It reduces evaporation. If the leaves of any plants do get wet, they have the day to dry off, which can help with any sort of fungal diseases like mildew that they might develop. And then the next important thing is mulch. So my mulch of choice is leaves. And like I said, in autumn, I go around my neighbourhood and collect large barrelfuls of dried leaves from various streets that would go to waste otherwise. Leaves do add organic matter to the soil as they break down, but the best thing about them in the nonno mindset is that they're completely free and readily available. There are some leaves that you shouldn't use, and they are the leaves from liquid amber. This is on a productive garden, I should say. Don't use the leaves of liquid amber, eucalyptus, or flame trees. So both of my nonnos did use grass clippings as mulch. And sawdust, actually, if that matter. If you follow them on that, you just need to make sure that, that it doesn't mat and suffocate the soil. And you also need to know that grass clippings and sawdust draw nitrogen out of the soil as they break down. So you need to be adding more nitrogen to it to compensate for that. Straw and hay is obviously wonderful. And if I can get my hands on it cheaply and locally, then absolutely, I love it. But it is a large expense in the garden, so that's why leaves are my number one choice. The other sort of more advanced gardening mulching move that my nonnos had was to use plants as a living mulch. And so they were just masters at fitting in so many plants into a garden space as possible, and leaving no room for exposed soil. And so that means that the plants are working as mulch. They would grow into each other and they would block weeds. And of course, there's incredible bang for your buck here, because not only are you getting more plants out of the same space, but then you're not having to buy mulch. But the drawback is if you do grow certain vegetables too close together, they might fail to fruit. You might be introducing some pests and disease problems into your garden. So it is a balancing act, and it is a slightly more advanced gardening move. So if you're starting out, don't start out with sort of working on a living mulch. But I'm currently doing it in my lettuce patch. I'm using parsley as a mulch. And so I'm just picking it quite regularly to keep it lower than the lettuce, but it's all around surrounding the lettuce and it's working quite well. Okay, so we are halfway through. I'm going to have a sip of my tea. And we're going to talk about the miracle of seeds. Watching a seed germinate, it just never gets old for any gardener, I found. It doesn't matter how many times you've done it. You know, my nonnos gardened for so many years and they always were sort of in wonder about seeds. Within a seed is everything needed to start a plant growing if you give it the right conditions. You can, of course, buy seedlings from nurseries, but growing plants from seed is cheaper. That's why nonnos love it. But it also allows you to experiment and plant more unusual varieties, because there are far more varieties available as seeds than there are as seedlings. And they're just a really great thing to swap and share with other gardeners. So I always think of my nonnos as being rich in very non-traditional ways. And one of the ways they were richest was in their seed bank. You know, they had all these great skills, they were resilient, they had tools, and then they had these seeds, which is a self-regenerating resource, which they could use to grow food for themselves and their families. So I'm really into learning the basics of seed saving, storing, and germinating. Just as something for us all to, it's just another great skill to have. So I'm going to tell you how I do it and we'll go from there. So the seeds you save yourself aren't just cheaper. And in fact, for me, I think they're free. They're also likely to be fresher and stronger than the ones you buy. And then if that's not reason enough to save your own seeds, they'll also adapt to your growing conditions and climate. So plants should get stronger and produce and yield more produce year after year. Now, I've listed some vegetables there that reproduce in other ways and herbs as well. So mushrooms, potatoes, these things aren't, it's not about seeds with those guys. And then fruit trees are planted from graftings and cuttings. So we're talking about other veggies, and it's important to not buy hybrid seeds if you plan on saving seed. So my seed saving philosophy is to save the best and eat the rest. So when the plant of any given vegetable is at their peak, I pick the very best one, the one that has the most produce, that looks healthiest, and I tie a little string around it so that I don't accidentally harvest from that plant. Because saving the seeds from your very best plant will make sure you have the strongest seeds for next season. And then you want to let them dry on the plant for as long as possible to let strong seeds develop. If you're able to let the seeds dry out completely on the plant, then absolutely do that. But for many of us gardeners, we don't have the time and space to allow for that to happen. So sometimes you do need to pull them out and hang them upside down somewhere to continue drying out. Now I'm going to be specific and start talking about some of the easier seeds. I should say with zucchini that they will cross-pollinate with squash. I don't grow any squash in my garden, so I am able to save my zucchini seeds readily. But if you do grow both, there's some challenges that I'll come to about that you'll have when seeds cross-pollinate. So with things like zucchini and eggplant, where they're in sort of a fleshy situation, you do need to wash them before you store them. So I scoop all those seeds out and I wash them in a sieve, and I sort of just wash them with my hands and try to get as much of that substance, whatever it is, off them. And then I let them dry in the sieve. And once they're completely bone dry, they're ready to be stored in little paper envelopes. Then, oh, sorry, I lost my spot. Then with other things like pak choi, rocket, they form little seed pods, and you can see in the top right-hand corner, that's some pak choi seed there that I'm breaking open into the bowl, and that seed is completely dry and ready to be stored. Then things like beetroot, lettuce, silver beet, they produce these cluster seeds at the top that you can just pick off. You can then let them dry somewhere. Often I let them dry completely on the plant and I scatter them immediately back into the garden to start growing again. And I've just included a photo of some beans that I saw on my walk a few weeks ago, where what this person's done is last spring, they've planted these beans, they've grown, all summer long they've had beans, and then they've left some beans on that plant, they've dried out completely. And what's happening is they're bursting open, the pods are bursting open and the seeds are falling to the ground. And I can always guarantee you right now, if they've done nothing and I walk past again, there will be little bean seedlings at the base of that structure ready to grow. Seeds are amazing. So there are some vegetables whose seeds like to be fermented, which is sort of not easy, but not super difficult. There's a really easy way to do this, which is to just cut the vegetable open and expose the seeds to the air for about a week before you then wash them as you would the zucchini and eggplant seeds, as I described. You can also put the seeds into a jar of water and then change that water daily for about a week, because little fermenty broth will form at the top, and so you just clean that away. For cherry tomatoes, my nonnos both had this amazing hack, I guess, where they grew so many varieties of cherry tomatoes. They would get some paper towel and they would just get a couple of cherry tomatoes of each variety, and they would squeeze and smear the inside of the cherry tomato across some paper towel. They would then write what variety it was. They would let it dry on the paper towel, and then they would put it away in their seed box for the year. And then come the following August, they would plant the paper towel into their seed raising mix. It's such a quick and easy way to get some seed saved at that time when you have lots going on. And it's a great way, especially for cherry tomatoes. I love it. Now, these are the tricky ones because of cross-pollination. Now, as a backyard gardener, there's all sorts of things you can do and strategies you can come up with to combat this. But what I do is I just buy seed and seedlings of these vegetables because it does involve hand pollination, exclusion netting to keep things separate. And the other thing is you might not mind a bit of cross-pollination. If you grow 3 varieties of corn, you might not mind the next year not knowing which one you're going to get or which sort of medium it will be, and that's fine too. But if you're the sort of person who you know what you want, you can just only grow that variety. It's much harder with brassica because of the wild brassica weed that's everywhere. But with corn, you can certainly do a lot of work, especially if your neighbours aren't growing corn. But I tend to just forget about saving the seeds of these and just buy them. And my nonnos did too, so I figure I have their blessing. So you've gone to all the effort to save those seeds. You do need to store them properly to keep them for how long they will remain viable, which is generally 3 to 5 years. Longer if you can keep them in a fridge or a freezer. I really treat my seeds as precious. And so I keep them in a wooden container, and I take good care of them. I go through them fairly regularly. Always label your seeds. Don't do what I did one year and I was convinced I would remember. A lot of seeds look identical, even despite being from completely different plants. I always try to save more than I think I'll need, just in case I have any problems with germination, and so I can share them. Seed swapping is just such a great way to meet other gardeners, I've found. Some councils have seed libraries that you can donate to and borrow from, which is amazing. And community gardens can be a really great source of seeds. Now, got those seeds and they're ready to grow. How do you do that? So for some seeds, they prefer to be sown directly into the garden. So that's particularly large size seeds. So beans, peas, broad beans. But then some things like carrots and parsnip also do need to be sown directly because otherwise they bolt to seed. As a rule of thumb, seeds should be planted to a depth that's twice the seed's width. And then you just want to make sure they come into firm contact with the soil and water them in gently. I find that the birds love to dig up all of my bean seeds, so I do put obstacles in the way to prevent that from happening. Then I move out of the way once they've germinated. Now, there are more delicate seeds that like to grow in seed raising mix and ideally in a greenhouse. So those are things like tomatoes and eggplants. So I'll show you the seed raising mix recipe in a moment, but the greenhouse really provides perfect conditions for seeds. It's warm, they're protected from winds and frost. And your setup doesn't need to be elaborate, especially when you're starting out. Just a clear plastic tub can be a greenhouse. And then again, I always plant more seeds than I think that I'll need, because some won't germinate. Most seeds have a germination rate of about 80%. And then some may not make it when they're transplanted. So it's good to have some backups always. So this is Nonno's seed raising mix recipe that I make regularly. It's really easy. I have everything on hand pretty much coming out of my garden except for that coconut fibre and propagation sand. So really I only need to buy two items to have seed raising mix at all times. Here we go. It's really important to protect your seedlings once they're planted into the garden, because also I should say at what point you should plant them into the garden. So usually, once the seed is germinated, it will have its first leaves, which is still a very young plant and nothing should happen at that stage. But once its next leaves grow, so the third and fourth leaves, it is established enough that you could put it into a larger pot or potentially out in the garden. So you just, depending how much space and time you have, but you just want to make sure you get it into the garden before it's become pot bound in whatever you've grown it in. And I will just quickly talk about hardening off, because I feel this doesn't get talked about enough. If you've grown your seeds in a sunroom or on a windowsill, it's a huge change for it to go from that environment straight out into the garden. And what you need to do is just get it outside for an hour or two each day and just increase the amount of sunlight and time that it's out there. So over a week, and then it should be ready to plant into the garden. I feel like often people go from something, a little seedling that's been on their windowsill straight outside and it doesn't make it. And that's often why. I also love exclusion netting for my brassicas because of the white cabbage moth. My nonnos used to be outside every single day picking off the eggs of the white cabbage moth off their 50 broccoli plants, but I found I'm much less reliable than my nonnos, so I just use exclusion netting so that they can never lay their seeds. How are we going for time? Okay, fine. So it's good to think about a seasonal plan. This is the third chapter in the book. You obviously need to know your own zone and what you can plant when, but I still think it's really important to only plant vegetables that you like to eat. There's no point growing a vegetable that you actually no one in your family or household likes eating. The process of growing it won't suddenly make you like it. So try not to be tempted by the lists of all the things that you can grow and just grow what you really like to eat. I prioritize fruit and vegetables that are expensive to buy or hard to find, more unusual varieties, that sort of thing. And then my available planting space dictates what I grow. I love pumpkin. I love growing pumpkin. I've grown pumpkin many times, but it really does take a lot of space where I could grow a lot of other vegetables and have a greater variety. So I tend not to grow pumpkin. I can also get pumpkins relatively easily and cheaply, organically, locally where I live. So it's not something that I feel that I really need to grow. You hear a lot about crop rotation, and that's where you shouldn't be planting the same crops in the same spot year after year, because doing that, it can encourage diseases, it can cause problems. So moving crops around the garden is really important, or refreshing the soil in pots. It's incredibly important in sustainable farming. I think it's less essential in a backyard garden, especially if you have a small garden and you simply can't rotate your crops and have it in a different spot every year for 4 years. So sometimes I'm just alternating things and just managing as best I can. And I haven't seen backyard gardeners have huge problems with crop rotation, so I feel quite comfortable with that. I try to do a lot of companion planting because there's some plants that grow well together because they need the same amount of light and water and the same soil conditions. So classic examples of that are tomato and basil, onions and carrots, and pumpkin and corn. And then there's two vegetables that should never be grown together, which is garlic and onions, which as an Italian is so strange to me because so many meals start with that combo. I try to plant for the pollinators as much as I can. So some flowers in the garden. I have a beehive, so I obviously need to keep my bees happy, but I also really want to encourage beneficial insects like dragonflies and hoverflies and butterflies. I find borage is great for this purpose, and it can be used in so many other ways around the garden and in the kitchen. Alyssium is really pretty, and I like it on garden edges. And then marigolds and calendula I grow a lot of, because they're not only good for the pollinators, but they can repel pests and protect your soil. And that's all part of bringing in those beneficial insects. So you've got to say, gardening is not without its challenges and disappointments. You do learn a lot from them, but they can be heartbreaking. And they can come in many different forms. And really, regardless of how good a gardener you are, you will be confronted with pests and diseases, and different ones in different years and different seasons, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. The trick I found is to really be an observer of your garden and try to see what's happening from a really early stage, because the sooner you notice it, the better. But that said, the thing that my nonnos most often did when they spotted a problem was nothing. And they just observed it, and they just saw if nature could take care of itself. So for example, if they had aphids, they would look around and see what the population of ladybirds was like, or parasitic wasps, and see if they could come in and deal with the problem. If that wasn't happening, they would of course step in, but they did sort of give the garden time to right itself. And then when they did intervene, they did it with as little intervention as possible. So for aphids, for example, it's just dishwashing liquid in some water, which hopefully will only harm the aphids and nothing else. If you don't know what a pest or disease that you have is, I think the best thing to do is to take a photo of it and take it to your local nursery. Such knowledgeable people work in nurseries. It's incredible. There's whole books on the subject, of course, and I'm sure the library has those, what garden disease or pest is this? I refer to that all the time, that book. Snails and slugs are special, and Nonno always used to like to go out after a light rain with some gumboots on and do a bit of squishing. He also loved beer traps and all of those sorts of things, because they can decimate your garden if the population's too big. And this was the recipe for white oil that my Nonno Michele used, and it's just things you should have in your house. It's nothing, and it's not a poison. I think that's really important to know. It'll suffocate pests and they will die. It can kill beneficial insects as well. So you really only want to be using white oil when there's no other alternative. Now I'll race through the last 3 chapters of the book, and I actually have a whole talk on chickens, so I won't go into that at all. But a lot of people are choosing to have chickens as part of their productive garden system, and I highly recommend it if you're able to care for them and give them the space and the love, I would say, that they need. I love my chickens. There's lots of things to know about chickens, and I sort of go into all the ways to prevent any problems, because really with chickens, prevention is the best medicine. But they're wonderful garden companions if they work for you. There's also a chapter on tools, because nonnos can really fix anything, and I think nothing is broken, and they take care of everything. So like I said, I have my Nonno Vincenzo's tools that he had his whole lifetime. They'll outlive me, they'll outlive the next person. They're really well cared for. Linseed oil on the handles pretty regularly, keeping all the tines straight. And I go in through the book about, how to oil and sharpen your secateurs, because when those things work really well, gardening is a real pleasure. And then the final chapter of the book is actually probably much more about my nonnas than my nonnos, but that's what to do with all this produce that you've grown. No matter how well you stagger things and all of that stuff, you are likely to have gluts of things. And it can be overwhelming at first, but once you know all these great ways that you can preserve them so that you're eating apricots in winter, again, there's a lot of joy in, and also eating the full vegetables. So eating, the tops of carrots and beetroot and daikon and all those sorts of things. Often, when you buy those vegetables, the tops have been cut off, and there's so many nutrients and great things in that part of the plant that when you grow it yourself, you have. So that's the end of my talk today. Thank you so much for your attention and for coming along to this chat about gardening at lunchtime. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions that might have come through.
Tracy. Hi, Jaclyn, it's Tracy. Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful. I'm still just fascinated by the cherry tomato seed saving method. It's amazing. I'm going to go home and try that. It's so simple. We do have a couple of questions. So firstly, Julie missed the second lot of group of companion plants that you mentioned. She said she got down pumpkin and corn and tomato and basil.
So the third one, oh gosh, tomato and corn, tomato and basil. I might have to look that up. I can't remember. Do you want to ask me the
I
next
couldn't remember
question?
either.
I'll find it. Oh, hang on, I've got it. Onions and carrots.
Onions and carrots.
Lovely.
And
they grow really well together in just straight lines. So you can have a really long bed of onions and carrots in rotating rows. And they look really lovely. Peter, that's a Peter Cundall actually trick too. If you're a Gardening Australia Peter Cundall fan, he may have taught me that, not my nonnos, because my nonnos didn't grow carrots.
Jane says, do you have any hot tips for preventing rats getting into the compost?
I absolutely do, Jane. So there's two, if we're talking about a plastic compost bin, there's two great things you can do, and you don't have to do both, you can do one or the other. So the first one is to bury it 10 centimetres deep. And the theory is that rats, despite them being these persistent, annoying garden pests, that they won't dig 10 centimetres. That's the magic number. What I do, I don't do that. What I do is I put a mesh base on my compost bin. So a really thin, small mesh. And it is slightly hard to do, but you cut a piece bigger than the bin, and then you gently sort of bend it around. And then with wire, I've attached it, and they absolutely cannot get into that. And I find I've had it for many years, and it's been 100% rodent proof.
Awesome. Joyce asked, do you or did your nonnos plant with the phases of the moon?
Yes. Oh my gosh, I talk about this a lot in the book. So yes, my nonnos were absolute believers in the phases of the moon, and the waning moons and the waxing moons, and what you should plant in a waning moon and what you should plant. And I go into all the Italian language for all of that. When I was researching this book, I really wanted to find out if there's any scientific basis to this moon planting. And it turns out there really isn't. But I have gardened so much and found that if I ever go against their advice and try to plant something in a moon cycle different to what they told me to, I often have either no germination or just a really average crop. So now I absolutely plant by their moon cycles. And a lot of nonnos absolutely do that, and I've always done that.
Great. And Jane also asks, best vegetables to grow in beds with low sunlight, so around 4 hours direct sun a day.
Yeah, so I mean, ideally you want 6 hours. That's sort of the dream. And with 6 to 8 hours, you can grow anything. With 4 hours, I would really focus on leafy green vegetables. So Swiss chard can grow in really low light levels. A lot of lettuce is quite happy in low light levels. Some herbs are pretty tolerant to low light. Rhubarb thrives in low light. It's a very hungry plant, so as long as you're giving it a lot of compost and manure, mine grows pretty much completely in shadow all the time, and it's very healthy, happy rhubarb. I've also had success with globe artichokes in low light. I don't get as many as I do in the sunny spots, but I'd rather have vegetables in my shady spots than nothing. Anything else in low light? Oh, warrigal greens. I'm obsessed with warrigal greens. They will grow in complete shade. I have some growing right now under one of my orange trees, and it gets absolutely no light, and it's so happy. The only thing to know with warrigal greens, I use it as a spinach substitute, but it does have to be cooked. It does have a lot of oxalic acid in it. It's a native ingredient. It's delicious. It's got far more nutrients than spinach does, but you just can't put it immediately into a salad. You do need to cook it. It's the only thing. But yeah, definitely get some warrigal greens in.
Yeah, we had a lovely Indigenous lady recently do a program for us, Auntie Daphne, and she spoke about those warrigal greens, and she did say you have to be very careful how you cook them, because they can be poisonous or make you feel not very well.
Exactly. You won't feel great, but as long as they're cooked for sort of at least blanched for at least 30 seconds, they're fine and they're delicious.
Do you know much about regrowing from other vegetables? So, for example, the white base of the spring onion, popping that into soil, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so the spring onion is the classic one. And so I have spring onions growing in my garden, but I'll occasionally, you know, there's times in the year when I've got lots of veggies in my garden, but nothing is ready to eat. And so I often get a veggie box from a local veggie box supplier, and they always seem to give me spring onions, which I don't really need, but I always resprout them. So that's just a matter of sort of cutting them about 2 centimeters above the root line. And then I put it into a jar of water on my windowsill, and once it started growing again, I then plant it out in the garden. And I find, and then I never pull out my spring onions. I always cut them at the base and they resprout in the garden. So for me, they're a perpetual vegetable, and they're so generous, and it's a wonderful thing to do. I know you can do it with celery. I've never done that. I've always grown celery from seed, but I'm pretty sure you can do the exact same thing with celery.
The gift that keeps giving. I love it.
Exactly. When you have nothing, you have everything.
Exactly. So we'll just ask one more question, and then we'll let you get on with your day. So how long did it take you to write the book and research, and are you working on another book at the moment?
Oh, what a lovely question. So the book came about because during Melbourne's long lockdown, when that started, a lot of my friends got into gardening, and they knew that I've always gardened and have been gardening for 25 years. And they started sending me messages saying, how should I do this? What should I do this? What should I do to my soil? And all these sort of questions. And so I started making little gardening videos on my Instagram just to answer their questions in a quick, sort of very, demonstrative way. And I was just thinking, there's a book in this. There's so many people interested in gardening and rediscovering it. And the things that my nonnos taught me really helped me so much in that period, again, when I thought I had nothing. And all our local nurseries were completely overwhelmed, shut down. Even Diggers Club, which is a source of where I get a lot of my seeds, they weren't, the backlog was incredible. So I couldn't get things that I could normally get really easily. And I had to really draw to mind all those things that they had taught me. And so the book took about 3 months of I was locked down, wasn't going anywhere. And I interviewed a lot of my family members to see if I'd forgotten anything. And I spoke to a lot of my friends who had nonnos who did things slightly differently to mine. And then I have a particular uncle in Italy who every time I've gone there, I stay with him on his farm, and I got really into gardening with him. And so I went through a lot of the things that he had taught me, and my nonno had taught him. And so that was a really useful resource. My nonno died a long time ago, but I had my uncle who was taught by my nonno. So to go to him and go, how did nonno show you how to do this? And it was a wonderful project that kept me busy and distracted and really happy, as my garden did throughout sort of the pandemic. And I think the importance of having a garden, like I don't complain about being locked down because I have a garden. I feel very lucky. It's like, oh, I'm okay. I have a garden.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad you did write the book. It's a gorgeous book. And thank you so much for sharing all of the wonderful no-nonsense advice and tips and skills that were passed down from your nonnos with us today.
Thank you so much, and happy gardening, everyone.
Yeah, so thanks again, Jaclyn, for joining us, and a big special mention to all those joining us from Victoria, because I know there are a few of you. So good luck with the rest of your lockdown. We hope to see you out of that soon. And Jaclyn's book can be purchased from any good local bookstore, or of course you can borrow it from your library. And please follow the Marion Library's Facebook page, City of Marion website, and check your inbox to be kept up to date on all of the upcoming Library Through the Lens presentations and workshops. And if you haven't already registered, please join us on Tuesday, the 2nd of November, as we welcome another wonderful Affirm Press author, John Byron, live from Sydney, as he talks about his debut thriller, The Tribute. So we do hope you'll join us then. And once again, thank you, Jaclyn.
Thank you so much.